Laurence, thank you so much for coming again and speaking with us about Richer Retrospectives and other things. I'm going to do some brief introductions and then we'll get started. Agile Stationery, that's us, me and Simon Gibbs. We run the business. And Agile Stationery, in a nutshell, is all about physical products for professionals. Whether you're looking at planning, retros, continuous improvement, redesigning your organization, or cybersecurity, we're all about physical products in that space. And this is how we got to know Laurence. Laurence, you, just a brief introduction, you have worked in various capacities: leadership coach, scrum master, you're an agile coach, an author, and you've spoken at various events, including the ones we've organized in the past. And you're a big advocate, if I may say, of physical tools in the workplace. And you've created a number of products, and we look after a couple of them on Agile Stationery, called Richer Retrospectives and Richer Roles. And we've spoken about Richer Retrospectives before, but today I think I'd like to know more about Richer Retrospectives in action. So it's going to be a lot about where they've been used, how the teams take it, what did we learn. For people who come on and join us, a bit of housekeeping. We'll focus first 20 to 30 minutes of the session learning about success stories, use cases, and Laurence's experience in using these cards in action. And so that's about it, really. So what we're hoping is we'll finish the formal session in 20, 30 minutes, and then we'll have an informal Q&A. Laurence, is that okay?
Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah, just throw questions in any time and we'll see how it goes, pick them up if we can. If not, we'll have a chat at the end.
That's great. Fantastic. So I'm going to kick off with a question, if that's okay. And it's hopefully going to lead on to the cards in action. But who are these cards for? Whose problem, Laurence, are you trying to solve? And whose problem did you think of trying to solve when you created these cards?
Yeah, I suppose the short answer is there for anyone who's involved in software delivery, really. They tend to be used, or sort of the facilitator tends to be a scrum master or something like that. But really, I thought about it for anybody. You can use them in lots of different ways, and we'll explore a bit of that today. But so I have, for example, in more recent years, I've been using them for quite a few years, but in more recent years, I've used them with senior leadership people. So some of the cards are relevant at an enterprise level. A lot of them are more relevant to an agile team, which is partly why they're different. You'll see they're different colors. So yeah, the short answer is anybody. The people I would expect to be using them regularly would be a delivery team.
There is one unusual scenario which you've mentioned in the past with me, where you use them with the MD of a company, or something. We'll come to that later. But that was an interesting scenario. I couldn't see those cards being used in that scenario, but so we'll talk about that later. So you talked about sort of delivery teams and Scrum Masters and Agile coaches using these cards. Why would they think about these cards? What, as I said, you're also trying to solve their problem, but what is their problem? What is the problem with retrospectives?
It tends, it's not so much a problem, but it tends to be how shall we do our retrospectives? So that's a common conversation is, oh, how do you do your retros? Have you got any new ideas? Teams often talk about changing the way they do the retro occasionally to keep it interesting. It can get boring and monotonous retrospecting, especially if things are not improving. So this was yet another way of running a retro. There's many ways of running a retro, but so what I hope happens, and this is partly why it's good to use a physical tool as well as online tools, is that if you use the cards in a retro, but then stick them on the wall somewhere near where some of you sit, that's a whole conversation in itself nowadays with COVID, etc. But the moving from it just being a retro tool to a physical permanent thing then helps you to get people thinking about continuous improvement often rather than just a retro, if that makes sense. So it's to answer your question, Devika, it sort of started as a retro tool, but I see it now as more of an ongoing continuous improvement tool as well. You can use it for either or both of those things.
Okay, fantastic. We've got people on the call now, and if you can tell us if you've used these cards before, and that will help us understand if we need to touch on the question of how do you use these cards. I don't want to spend too much time in it, but since you mentioned the cards on a wall, the scenarios where people can continuously see it, briefly, Laurence, if you can, talk about maybe a case or a team where you where you use them that way.
Yeah,
How
sure.
did the teams
And
take
you've got some photos of those as well, but I'll
Yes, I
start
do.
by referring to these.
Okay.
So I've put these on the wall today deliberately because as you said, Devika, I like physical things. I'm all about creating interactions. I don't really mind what people do with the cards. It's about the interactions that they can create. But just briefly, for anyone who doesn't know, it's effectively a survey of carefully worded questions. So people, if we take this as an example, it says we decide as a team what to commit to, which is a common conversation. Is, you know, what are we going to commit to? Are we going to overcommit? But so the team discuss that and decide which column to put it in. So this team have decided that they often decide as a team what they commit to. So they put it in this column. If they struggle with that, they probably would put it over here, but every team's different. That's the whole point. So the team, there's 40 odd cards that the team can lay out, but I encourage them to just pick a few to get going. So I've just put some up here as an example. I won't go through all of them, but the other thing that sort of links into one of your questions, Devika, is that I've put things at the top which are sort of team things. Whereas, for example, if I look at this one here, this says we get the time we need with leadership. And this team has said that they rarely or sometimes get that, which suggests there might be a problem. Well, at an enterprise level, if lots of people are saying that they're not getting the time they need with the leadership, we know that there's a challenge at enterprise level to make leadership more available, for example. So I'm sort of starting to imply that the ones at the bottom, I've actually got some stickers here, that we could say these ones are enterprise type. Not exactly, but those are enterprise topics, whereas these ones at the top are team topics. And then perhaps we might even have, I've sort of put 3 levels: team of teams, enterprise, and team. So you can use it at all those levels, depending on which questions you pick. Does that make sense, Devika?
That does make sense. You're essentially introducing sort of multiple dimensions, really, to how you arrange the cards.
Yeah, and you don't have to do that, but that's what I tend to do.
Does this setup work with a large number of teams? Again, we've touched on this before. Obviously, this technique drives conversation. I think this is one of the reasons why you developed it as a physical tool. Sitting in a meeting room, talking about things, it just increases the quality of that conversation that you would otherwise have online. But can it be used in some form of quantitative analysis at a large scale when you have multiple teams in the organization?
Yeah.
Have you got an example of that, perhaps? Yeah.
So the idea is very much, because I tend to work in big organizations with 50 or even 100 teams. In fact, in one example, 200 teams. So it's common to basically not have enough coaching available. I'm not saying coach, but coaching. So that's common. So when you're thinking at scale, the way I use this, and so for example, William Hill, we gave each team a card in the NHS, a set of cards. In the NHS, I've done the same thing. But the teams are operating using that interaction at a team level. But when I mentioned these sort of enterprise level things, what we can do, the reason there are numbers on here. So if somebody puts this card there's a card here. In fact, let's keep talking about the same card. So the one about we get enough time with leadership, that has got the code U11 on it, which doesn't really mean anything other than it's unique. And that's been put in column 1 or 2. So I'd probably record that as column 1 for card U11. So that means that I can then gather metrics and roll them up. And I can say things to leadership. I can say things like 70% of your 100 teams are saying that they rarely get enough time with leadership. Or let's say a positive thing. There's a positive card here that says we are proud of the value that we have delivered. I could go back to leadership and say 50% of your teams are proud, or always proud of the value they've delivered. So straight away you're getting metrics so something quite soft and interactive can actually create some hard enterprise level metrics that you can then use to make investment decisions, education decisions, etc. Does that make sense, Devika?
That does make sense. We have a question on chat, which is from Berit, and Berit's asking, can you use these cards, I presume the way you've displayed them on board, online? And obviously he's posed that question for hybrid teams. What's your take on that?
Yeah, so it's a really, I mean, we could talk all day about that, couldn't we? I try not, I mean, now I'm standing up deliberately in front of a board, which I think is probably quite unusual on team. Well, I know it's relatively unusual on a Teams call. So I don't always do that, but yeah, these cards probably lend themselves more to showing you a photo of each card, and we can do that, and I do that. I often take photos and distribute photos, but my experiences show that if I can create interactions, even if people say, "Oh, I can't read that one, what does it say?" and I read it out to you, that's actually creating an interaction. So it's not perfect, but it's definitely part of my tool set to get people talking about stuff, which as a coach is often my job. I'm trying not to tell people what the answer is. I'm trying to get them to tell me what their problems are and help them to come up with solutions. So I think the answer to your question is yes, I always work in big organizations. I've only ever worked, and it was quite recently, in one organization where everybody was in the same office. Most of the time, 100 teams, 50 teams, 3 cities, 3 countries, etc., as probably most of you do. But I still use these physical tools quite often. It probably makes me think of the other bit that you mentioned, Erica, as well, is that when I went in to meet some senior people who were running a business for the first time, I actually took the cards with me and picked out some cards that I knew were pertinent. But after that, I then put the cards on the wall and got their teams working with more cards. And then we took photos and shared the photos remotely. So what I quite like to do is create an interaction and a memory around the cards, but then you can go electronic, but still keep that memory of that original conversation, if that makes sense. So the photo is electronic and shareable, but it still represents that original interaction that we had on the first day.
Yeah, and we've spoken about, you know, the sort of playing the game online versus, you know, using physical cards. And I think one of the points you've mentioned in the past is, you know, these days, especially for hybrid teams, you have limited days with each other at work. And so for those in the office days, having something physical that people can gather around and have and use as a point of conversation, it just enables that better collaboration and face-to-face conversations, which are sometimes they can get lost online, you know, when you're kind of behind a screen. Not everybody might feel have the confidence to speak up all the time.
We're in what I think we'll start calling the post-COVID era, that most places that I've worked now, or most places that I help, go into the office once a week-ish. So some never go in, but most do. So I'm starting to think that the strength of these physical tools is about those rare and valuable days when we're together. I don't really want people to make the effort of traveling into a city and then sit on a Zoom call. I will try and stop that, because to me that doesn't make sense. So when we're together, let's create rich interactions and innovations and then go home to use our Zoom calls. I know it's not as simple as that, but that's what I'm always working towards, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. We have another question, and I think it might be good to mention it now, since you talked about metrics earlier. And the question is from Simon: the procedure to roll up statistics to the organization is also supported by Squad Health Check, which is another model used by teams to conduct their retros and improve their team health. That game comes with a health warning not to compare metrics between teams. Do you think that health warning applies equally to Richer Retros, or are the metrics more flexible?
Yeah, I think that probably that warning about comparing teams might apply to everything, I think. So yeah, definitely I would agree, Simon. Be careful comparing. The example I gave was something like 50% of your people think they rarely get enough time with the leadership. I wouldn't necessarily want to expose to the leadership who those teams are necessarily, but it's quite a powerful metric to show that we need to do something. So yeah, I would say the specific metrics are for the team, the trends, etc., are for the enterprise, or for the portfolio, or whatever language you use.
Another question about your cards when they are used in the format as you've displayed in the background. Traditionally, if you think about retrospectives, then generally it's more like you have your post-it notes, you have your the good, bad, the ugly columns, and you have your team members and you give them blank post-it notes, and they would, capture their thoughts and then put their thoughts of certain processes that went well, didn't go so well, put them in the appropriate columns. And it's more of a open kind of a clean slate, and the members contribute those thoughts and processes which they want to discuss. Obviously, with yours, these are captured in these cards already. Have you kind of sensed in a team where you've introduced these cards to help them do their retros? Has there been any pushback? Has that been a reason that they've challenged, or perhaps not quite, fully understood and adapted to?
Yeah, that makes sense. So it's more prescriptive than what you might just call an open retrospective. I'm never saying to people that this is the only way you will retrospect from now on. It's just a tool, and you can use it every day or once a year. That's fine. What I would say is you get going much faster because the sentences are already written for you, and the sentences are very carefully written because I've been changing them for about 5 or more. You can probably tell me how many years there ago. So there's been quite a few iterations of this and of the roles game as well. Richer roles. Yeah. So the words are pretty carefully chosen. They're not perfect though, and it's all about context. So what does often happen, especially in a big organization where you've got lots of different ways of working, is that we'll get to a card and decide that it's not relevant. And then I would say to them, well, don't use it then. That's fine. You don't have to do everything. If it's not relevant, then choose something that's more. I always say, which card is the most interesting, and use that card next. You don't have to do all of it. But so I think that my short answer is it's prescriptive to get you going faster, but it's optional. So it's actually not prescriptive. Is that okay?
That's okay.
One bit to add as well, in terms of making people focus, there is a card that we haven't looked at yet. So if the team look at this, I often say to people, what do you want to do next? It's a good question to get people to focus. And so I'll get them to vote or something like that. And I'll often say, which is the most interesting card? Which card do you want to move? So obviously it's in one column. So if we take another example, everything seems to be mandatory or must have. So they're saying that that's often the case. So they might decide that that's a problem and they want to deal with that. So I would say, well, how are we going to do with it? And they actually stick the focus card on there. And here I've put a sticker, I'll just move that up a bit. A sticker that says that Bob is going to focus on that. And so when anybody looks at this, they can see, right, this is the card we're focused on. We'd have a conversation about when are we going to try and move that card? And they might say, we want everything to seem mandatory or must, only rarely within 3 months, or whatever their goal. So come up with a goal. That now is Bob's problem to define that goal and talk to people and work out what we're going to do about it. I'm not going to tell them what to do, but I have helped them decide that that is their favorite problem. Yeah. So we're going to try and move that card to there by next time, for example. Not try and move everything, because that's just chaos.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the biggest kind of strengths of Richer Retros. Your technique allows people to focus, which sometimes that focus can get lost when you have lots of issues, as you've spoken about in the past.
Yeah,
too many things need to change at the same time.
And that's a big challenge as a coach or a scrum master, that you see so many things that you want to fix, or we should say improve. But actually what I've learned as a coach in the enterprise is a lot of it is about what you're not going to touch, and deciding what are the not quick wins, but the things that are scalable interventions. So, in this example, it would be, well, everything's mandatory. There's probably something there about looking at the product community and helping them to prioritize with teams in a different way more successfully. They've got too many musts, for example. Probably an education intervention there that I could put in.
Got it. Okay. I mentioned briefly earlier that you've used these cards with an MD in the past, kind of more on a one-on-one level, and that surprised me. Talk to the attendees more about that, if you can, please, Laurence.
Yeah, so I was going into a company for the first time to talk to the managing director about how I could help them, and they had some challenges that I was aware of at a very high level. So what I did is I went through all the cards on my own and just picked out, I think I picked out 4 cards that felt pertinent to the problems I believed they had. And so, and I didn't even really use the column headings. I actually just put the cards on the table while we were talking, and there was another director there as well. And I found it quite a useful way of just accelerating the conversation, and partly by luck and maybe partly by skill, but I picked some cards that were really pertinent to their worries. So that felt like that was a key part of why they then hired me to come in as their coach. So that was using the cards in quite an informal, a loose way, but I'd curated the situation. But I like informal situations. You won't really see me go in with a slide deck or a printed document. I like to create interactions, and that was the first time I've done that at a very senior level, using the cards first. Does that make sense, Devika? I explained
it does make sense. Well, when I first heard about it, then my initial reaction was that, well, to help someone understand kind of roles and responsibilities, or, you know, at a more kind of at a one-person level, your richer roles deck makes more sense. But looks like here, because you had a good understanding of the content in the deck, you could actually identify certain things within this deck that were relatable for that person, and that allowed you to.
Several of the cards point to, you know, common situations that I see in most places. For example, roles and accountability is a conversation almost everywhere I go. So is metrics. People are always asking about metrics. How do we do our metrics? So anything in that sphere, in those 2 spheres, is almost always relevant. But then other things I picked based on talking to people in the organization and just getting an idea of what their pain points were.
Okay, so if anyone's thinking about your cards and your technique, are there any kind of tips that you'd like to give them on how to facilitate the sessions? Are there any things they definitely shouldn't do? Are there any things that they should definitely do when they're thinking about using your cards for the first time?
I don't think there's anything they shouldn't do, and I pride myself on never saying that anything's wrong. I don't like to get into people get into arguments about what's right and wrong in agile. I think that's a waste of time and doesn't build relationships. So that nothing's wrong, and I love it when people come back and say they've used any of the tools I've created in a different way, because then I learned something new, which is great. One thing that I would really recommend is to try. This sounds a bit stupid. It sounds a bit weird, is to try and sit around the table, preferably a circular one. I'm quite into physical human interactions, etc. So if you can make it very democratic, that's great. And linking onto that, something that's easy to do, even if you're doing this remotely, is to take in turns picking a card. So I wouldn't be standing at the front touching the cards. I don't like the fact that this is my handwriting. I would be encouraging the team to, and maybe not even the scrum master, but the team to take in turns to either pick the next card. You know, I let them do it how they want, but they might have the cards in a pile. They just take the next one random. Or what I quite like to do, if we haven't got enough time, is actually throw the cards on a table and then ask them in turn to pick a card. And I might say pick a card that's interesting or pertinent or worrying or whatever, depending on the context. But so I'm encouraging them to drive it and them all to get involved. So for example, it might be, I've got some more cards here. So let me pick one. We talked about roles. So this card's about roles. So I might be, say I'm a developer and I'm going to read this one out. We overlap and operate outside our roles. So I read that to the team. And then I'm going to, as a developer, I'm going to suggest where it goes and get the team to agree with me. And then already I've created a nice interaction because they'll argue about it, which is actually what I want.
Yeah.
But the developer is then driving that conversation, not me as a coach or the scrum master. Does that make sense? So that's one thing I would recommend, is be democratic and get everybody to do it.
Okay, that's a good idea. Simon's asked another question, which is there a time when the impact of this tool has surprised you? Good, in a good way or a bad way?
I don't think it's revolutionary. So we've talked about the good way, that I was pleasantly surprised about how I could use it for the first conversation with an organization. that was a pleasant surprise. But I think that would happen after the cards are more familiar to you, to be honest. Obviously, they're very familiar to me. So I don't think I've got a great answer to that question, Simon. But I think the best thing I can say is that it always amazes me how simple stuff creates great interactions. So this is simple. This is not rocket science, but it does create interactions. And in fact, the MD that we talked about, she gave me she put something on LinkedIn that said that I was genius at making the complex simple. And I think that what I do is really simple. But if it creates interactions within a complex environment, then that's really powerful, even though it's simple.
Okay. Now, I don't know the background or the teams in which our participants work in, whether they work in agile teams or hybrid teams or non-agile teams, but can your deck be used by any kind of team, or would they work best with agile teams?
Yeah, good question. And it explains, because people normally say, why are things different color? So the colors actually link to, so this one, for example, card A20, the pink ones are quite agile. So this one talks about visible goal and a sprint. So that is agile language. If you weren't using agile, you wouldn't understand that. So if you weren't using agile, I'd say you start with these orange cards, and this one is U6, which is U is for universal, A is for agile. So this one says we decide as a team what we commit to. Now any team could do that. They could do that using waterfall or using anything. So these orange ones are actually relevant to any team actually doing anything. It's just a team. One of them says we are a happy team. That's an orange one.
Yeah.
The green ones are somewhere in between there. So I call them fusion. So F31. Other teams have told us that they benefit from our show and tell or demo. Well, a demo is not unique to agile, but it's kind of a show and tell is kind of agile language. So there's something there that's about. So the green ones, I'd start with the orange ones, move to the green ones, and then when you think you want to use agile language, then move to the pink ones. Does that make sense?
That does make sense. And actually, I think that makes this product a lot more accessible, because when you think of retros, you think of agile as an agile ritual.
Yeah.
So
It's a good point. So when I was talking to the managing director and the director, I would probably have been using pink cards, because the agile ones, they would have gone, well, what's a sprint? And I don't think that's their problem to worry about that. I'll tell them if they want to know, but I'm not going to use jargon that's just going to slow them down.
Okay. Well, we've kind of come to the end of our 30-minute session, and there were some questions as we went along. Fantastic. Well, I think our attendees are sort of signing off, I believe, slowly. They have thanked you for their for your participation. But Laurence, thank you so much for talking to us again about Richer Retros in action this time, and hopefully we'll see you soon on Richer Roles.
Okay, thanks then. See ya.
Thanks, Laurence.